All right, welcome back to another very special edition of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels. Or is it? That is a decision I will leave up to you folks. Today is a show I've been telling you about. Now, if you've noticed, I normally don't tell you the dates and times of guests because things happen. And like I mentioned with Graham Hancock a few months ago, if I told you he would appear that following Tuesday, which something happened and I had to push him for the following week, I would have got the blowback. So even though I mentioned that we will be talking about all things SETI today, talking to the senior astronomer and dare I say, also the director, because he is the senior astronomer at SETI, the one and only Dr. Seth Shostak. Dr. Shostak, welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show.
Well, Dr. J, it's a pleasure to be speaking to you again.
Let me tell you a little fun fact is back when I got out of high school and I was completely oblivious what I was going to do with my future, before I had a successful business in junior college, which ended up leading to an economics degree and then to law school and beyond, I really wanted to be a member of SETI. And of course, I went down a different path, but look, instead of practicing law, I am sitting here talking with you. So I guess this is as close as I'll get to the time being.
Okay.
Now, let's go back and give us a brief rundown of when Carl Sagan founded SETI and after that when you joined yourself.
Right. Well, SETI, modern SETI, I mean, you have to keep in mind that even people at the time of the American Civil War were talking about, signaling the Martians and stuff like that, or listening for signals from the Martians. Well, not listening, but looking. So the idea goes back a long way. But modern SETI, using radio receiving technology and so forth, that actually goes back to 1960. It wasn't Carl Sagan. The first people to think of what SETI is today were a couple of physicists at MIT, actually, and then eventually Cornell. And also Frank Drake, who did the first modern SETI experiment. That was in 1960. So that began modern SETI. Carl Sagan had some connection to SETI in that he popularized it, and he also translated or at least edited a Russian book about this subject. So he certainly had influence, but he wasn't involved in founding the SETI Institute or modern SETI.
That actually clears up a lot, but you're absolutely right that he did popularize it. That was the thing. I would read things about in the 70s, 80s, and even in the early 90s until his health started to decline. And, before you became the face of SETI, that was who I grew up looking up to. But that's interesting that you brought up Frank Drake because he is a very integral part because for those of people out there who don't know, Frank Drake devised the Drake equation. And can you break down the variables that he used in that? I believe it was the lifetime of civilizations, which we don't know because the only civilization we can look back at is ours, and we don't know what the lifetime of is, it right? And that's just one of, is it 8 or 10 different variables that multiplies to get the percentage? And I believe he had a book which was, Drake equation or something along Drake equation equals 1, essentially 100% probability. Am I right that he wrote that book?
I don't know about that book. He has a license plate, Dr. J, that says N equals 1. In other words, what he was saying was that, the number of, no, that's not what it says. I take that back. What his license plate says is N equals L. L is one of the terms, it's actually the last term, in the Drake equation. So just to back up a moment, the Drake equation indeed is just a series of terms that when multiplied together, it's already getting mathematical, but when they're multiplied together, you get an estimate for the number of societies out there in the Milky Way galaxy who are broadcasting signals that we might pick up, okay? And there are 7 terms in the equation. They consist of, how many stars are being made every year in the galaxy, and what fraction of those stars have planets, and what fraction of those planets are really, lovely planets like the Earth, and then what fraction of those actually produce life, and what fraction of those produce intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. So you multiply all this together, and you get the number of societies out there that Captain Kirk can hope to visit. And of course, we don't know what the answer to that is, but there are plenty of estimates.
Now, let me take you to a controversial crop circle, and for the sake of the argument, let's assume it's true. And what I'm referring to is, let me pull up the image for everyone here to see while I describe it to you. Essentially, it was a binary message that was sent by us to the unknown in space, and it basically described where we are as far as our solar system within the location of our galaxy, the Milky Way, the the double strand of the DNA, the size of our bodies, essentially. I don't know if it went into the sex organs. I'm not quite able to read that small fine print, but it also mentioned our signal out there was how we are using a radio telescope. And if you recall, there was a crop circle that some say, that's why I'm saying for the sake of argument, that it was a real reply. And aside from the differences in body, the differences in DNA and locations of where they are, supposedly, I think it was Zeta Reticuli, occupy two stars. But the one interesting thing that I wanted to ask you about, I've actually wanted to ask you about this for quite some time, and it slipped in the previous interviews we've done over the last 8 years or so, was that in the reply, supposedly, instead of using a radio transmitter, I believe the inference was to use a microwave transmitter. Are you aware of this, the one that I'm talking about? I want to say it was an Arecibo, but I could be completely wrong.
Well, there was a message sent into space when Frank Drake was the director of the Arecibo Observatory. Okay. And that message was sent, I think it was 1974. And it consisted of an image made up of essentially bits. In other words, it was an image sort of analogous to what you see in the newspaper, if anybody remembers what a newspaper is. If you look at the black and white pictures in a newspaper, or even the color ones, actually, you'll see they're made up of little dots. It's called halftoning. And so it's a technique by which you can use just black ink, which is all you've got for a black and white photo. Black ink, no gray ink or anything like that. Black ink to make shades of gray and so forth and so on. So it's a one bit, if you will, image. It's a raster of either dots that are white or are black. Okay, and in the case of this message that was sent to space, that means the black would be, here's one tone, and white would be a slightly different frequency tone. Okay, so very simple picture, and it showed a double helix, and it showed the Arecibo Observatory, and it showed some stick figure human and so forth. This was all sent into space, but a couple of, well, how many years has it been? It's been at least 10 or 15 years now since something very similar to this appeared in Britain in a crop circle near Chilbolton, actually. There's a radio telescope at Chilbolton. I don't know if that's what you're speaking about, but maybe it is.
Well, yeah, you actually described it, and so yeah, I think you might be right of where I was wrong of where it came from where it was placed on Earth, and
Came a
so
cropper?
yeah, yeah, that was completely wrong. Where this crop circle was placed on Earth. So you described exactly what I'm talking about. So the question I have is hypothetically, if we were able to transmit signals via microwave, how would that work? I mean, was that again? This is all just if hypothetical. If this was real, is that a plausible way for us to send signals? Essentially, what I'm asking is were they trying to say if that was real, that the signals we're sending via radio are sort of outdated to what they use? Would that be a fair argument by
Well,
looking?
Dr. J, microwaves are radio. So I'm not quite sure what you're trying to say there.
I
But,
guess the confusion I have is what was the message reply trying to tell us as far
oh,
as what we should be using to transmit messages, because clearly the what they drew compared to what we sent out were two different devices of sending and receiving messages.
well, I don't know about that, but I think what it was saying was that if you want to get in touch with the aliens, the thing to do is carve graffiti in your wheat. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what it was really saying. I mean, there was nothing different about the frequency. None of that was changed. What was changed in the crop circle version of this particular message was uh, in describing the chemistry of our bodies. Our body chemistry, we're carbon based, as they love to say on Star Trek. And so, humans and all other critters and plants are made of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and so forth. But they had replaced carbon with silicon in this crop circle, suggesting that, well, we aliens were just like you, except that our DNA has whatever DNA they have is made with silicon instead of carbon. It was sort of an inside joke, I suppose. But, I think what it was really saying was that we're going to make this crop circle right near this big antenna over there. And I have to say, at the time, I recall calling up actually one of the people who works at the Chilbolton antenna and asking him if he knew about this. And of course he did, because it was a big story. And he just laughed and he said it was an artist collective that made it.
Now, science, we have rigorous testing standards. And if we can't reproduce in an experiment, if we can't reproduce the same effect more than once, then how are we able to test it? And what I'm referring to is the wow signal. Some people look at that wow signal in the 70s that came out as being, hey, our first contact via the SETI program producing some results, but it was only a one-time thing. We were never able to test that again, were we?
Well, we certainly tried to test it by looking again at the same spot on the sky and looking at other frequencies and using equipment that was more sensitive and all that. We tried to find the signal again. When I say we, I don't mean just the SETI Institute. There were many such experiments, and nobody has ever succeeded in finding that signal a second time. And in fact, they didn't even find it a second time at the original discovery site, which was the Ohio State Radio Observatory. They observed again a minute later and didn't see it.
Since then, has there been any more anomalous signals that raised your suspicions that, kind of hoping that by checking and looking again, that it might be repeated and was maybe found to be questionable? Or is it nothing like the wow signal has been caught since then?
Well, see, here's the thing about the wow signal. That, as I say, was in the 1970s. And I think that was 1977. But in any case, that was in those days, if you had a big antenna and you were pointing it at the sky and hoping to find something, you couldn't do real-time processing of those data. The computers simply weren't fast enough. So what you would do is you use those big tape drives you always see in the old sci-fi movies. It's science when you have these big tape drives. And you'd use the tape drives to record the data, and then you would take the reel of tape, or as many reels as you'd filled up, and you'd take them back to your home turf, wherever that was, usually a university or an observatory somewhere, and you would play them on the computers there and slowly reduce the data as quickly as you could with the computers of the time. But what that meant was that you would often find signals in those data, and you say, gee, Bob, here's an interesting signal. But, you're not sitting at the telescope anymore, so you can't check it out again. Certainly not immediately. You have to wait till you're back at the telescope. So that was very inefficient. And it led to a lot of signals that were found once and not again. Just like the wow signal. The thing about the wow signal, of course, is it has an appealing name.
Yeah. And the reason it has the appealing name is because the astronomer who was looking at the readout basically recognized, I think, was it the strength of the signal, and that's why he wrote wow?
Well, it was a combination of the strength and the shape that it had, which indicated that it was something that was, extraterrestrial, if you will, or it certainly looked like it was extraterrestrial. Nobody knows what it was. Maybe it was interference. Maybe it was an Earth satellite. Maybe it was ET. I mean, nobody knows.
Now let's shift into the Kepler Telescope, which the last time we spoke, which has been quite some time, a few years, because I had a 2-year hiatus, but that's beyond that. That's been a game changer. I recall the first exoplanet that we found, and then it sort of became on a regular basis. And then before that, we discovered our first Goldilocks planet. And then what's the number at Goldilocks planets that we are currently suggesting are possible habitable zones that we have right now?
There are quite a number of planets that are in the so-called habitable zone. They're like 4,500 planets found around other stars so far. So exoplanets total about 4,000 and some. But the number of planets that are sort of the same size as the Earth and that are at the right position from their home star so that the temperatures are not too cold or too hot for liquid water, the number like that, so those are, I guess you would call them cousins of Earth, perhaps. I mean, it's 3 dozen, 4 dozen. But keep in mind that that's because the instruments used to find these things are not sensitive enough to find most of them, right? It's because Earths are small. You think about it, Jupiter weighs more than all the other planets put together. And so Earth is very small and it's hard to find. But, you can play tricks. You can do a statistical analysis of these data, and people have done that. And their conclusion is that 1 star in 2, maybe 1 star in 3, has an Earth-sized planet in the so-called habitable zone. So it sounds like they're in the Milky Way galaxy. In other words, there could be 100 to 200 billion planets that could be potentially like the Earth.
I read that the possible number of exoplanets could be as high as 1.8 planets per star. Is that something unfounded that somebody just made up and wrote? Or do you think that's leading upwards of possibly being able to confirm that and possibly be an accurate number?
Well, that could certainly be true. In fact, the number could be higher than that. Most stars have planets. If you could look carefully at almost any star, you can see them wobble. Planets seem to be extraordinarily commonplace. At least 70% of stars have planets, and the real percentage could be higher. But 70% is almost 100% already. So you really don't need much more. I mean, planets are they're as common as fire hydrants. They're everywhere.
I normally am going to wait till the last 15, 20 minutes to take some questions, but I see one here. And for everybody out there, if you got questions, please put them in caps because we do have 1 hour max today. That's all we agreed on. So I don't want to go over that. But the first one here is from Lu Shihan Lu. It's a pleasure that you're back on here. And he writes to you, Dr. Shostak, what about habitable moons?
Yeah, I'm all for them. Tell Lucy that I endorse them at every opportunity. But, we don't have an example of a habitable moon yet. We have examples of moons that could be inhabited, right? There are at least, 5 or 6 in our own solar system. Europa and Ganymede and Callisto and Enceladus and Titan. That's 5. Maybe it isn't 6. Anyhow, so there are 5 right there that, they're suspected of having liquids. And in fact, they're basically known to have liquids under the surface in most cases, although Titan has liquids on the surface. But, so they could be inhabited. I mean, if you took all the flora and fauna of Earth, it's sort of like a Noah's Ark project, and you just dump them all into the ocean of Europa, a lot of them be uncomfortable. But if you just did that, and came back a year later, would any of that be still alive? And the answer is yes. Yes. I mean, not things like elephants or tigers, but some bacteria would survive. So these are places where you could have life. It all depends on whether it got started there.
What about, what's your opinion on the methane on Mars that was found but then subsequently seemed to have disappeared? And I know that there's the current rover that just landed, the rover is trying to find samples that would contain either fossilized bacteria or possibly still living bacteria, which would explain the methane. But none of that explains where it disappeared, unless, of course, it's a cycle. Can you tell us your professional opinion on that?
Well, I talked to the Mars specialists, and they don't understand it yet either. It remains a mystery. In fact, in the beginning, there was some question of whether that methane was a legitimate discovery, whether there really was any methane on Mars. I think it's pretty solid that there is this methane gas. But you're right. Sometimes it disappears for a while, then it comes back a little bit. And that could be, bacteria that because, the weather on Mars is warmed up, the season is the summer on Mars. So the water kind of defrosts a little bit underneath the ground there, underneath the surface. And when it does that, then the bacteria all spring back to life out of their, uh, they're no longer in their spore phase, and they start metabolizing, and their exhaust gas is methane in the same way that our exhaust gas is carbon dioxide. And so suddenly you get a lot of methane, and then the winter comes, and they all become dormant again. I mean, that could be, but it could also be uh, something totally non-biological. I mean, it could be just that you have underground, well, you do have underground sources of heat on Mars, the kind of things that produce volcanoes on Earth. And, they get active, and then they get less active, and they get active and they get less active. And when they get active, volcanoes produce methane too. So the question is, have we found evidence for volcanoes on Mars, or have we found evidence for Martians on Mars?
Well, hopefully this rover mission will be able to tell us that, and at least Elon Musk, is the SpaceX has been working out the Falcon rockets and the Falcon Heavy rockets. So I think that after the 10-12 year absence of the space shuttle and having to hitch rides with the Russians to get to our international space station, now has changed forever, thankfully, with the reusable rockets. Now, I recently learned, and I must have been living under a rock to not have known about this program from a couple years ago where they launched uh, essentially a crystal, a very hard crystal, to the moon. And it has 60,000 analog images, which basically are photos to help the whoever recovers it millions or billions of years down the line to build a computer, and then in that crystal, literally in the volume of just a couple drops of liquid, contain the entire Wikipedia. And so once these 60,000 analog pictures are looked at, and a computer, our kind of computer, is built, then the beings or whatever, and maybe future humans, who knows, will be able to go and decipher what Wikipedia was at the time of us sending it. Do you know the name of that project and what I'm referring to?
I've been living under a rock, Dr. J, because I haven't heard of it either.
All I do know is that it successfully made it to the moon, but unfortunately the ship crashed into the moon. But they said that the crystal was so hard that it survived, although we can't confirm that until we have boots on the moon again, which Lord knows when, but that's a different thing.
Well,
Okay.
well, assuming that this is a legit story, how do they intend to mark the spot where this crystal is so anybody could find it?
Very, very good point, and hopefully someone in the chat will be able to dig that up while we continue to talk for the next 25 minutes. Lou has another question for you here. What about the recent chemical maybe found on Venus?
Yeah, phosphine gas in the atmosphere of Venus, not on the surface of Venus, but in the atmosphere up a little higher where it's cooler, where temperatures could be as lovely as they are in downtown LA. Uh, there was a claim by groups both in the United Kingdom and even at MIT that they had found, indeed, with a radio telescope, actually, they had found evidence for phosphine gas in the atmosphere of Venus. And you might say, well, what do I care about phosphine? It's just that phosphine is another one of those gases that is mostly produced by biology. There are only two ways, to make a lot of phosphine, and one is to have a whole bunch of bacteria, and the other way is to do it via volcanic action. Well, I mean, there, evidence for some volcanoes on Venus, so maybe that's all it is, except that you would need really a lot of volcanoes to explain the amount of phosphine that seems to have been detected. And the other option, that there's just floating life in the thick clouds of Venus, that's just high enough up, 10 miles up or something like that, where the temperatures are tolerable, that's just living there, floating life. We don't have that here on Earth. I mean, you look up at the sky and you don't see any green clouds filled with photosynthesizing microbes, but maybe Venus has them. And so that was a big story because nobody thinks terribly much about the possibility of life on Venus. There are some, but not many. And so it caused quite a bit of stir. And these are very legitimate people. But it turns out that whole detection now may be a red herring because the way they reduce the data, did something that could very easily introduce the appearance of a spectral line that would indicate phosphine. So it's not even clear that the phosphine is there. So all the other conclusions that, well, this phosphine is due to Venusians are suspect now too. So we don't know.
The lunar project that I was referring to is called Lunar Library, and from space.com, let me just read you the title. It says Lunar Library aims to preserve humanity's history on the moon, Wikipedia 2. And here, I'm going to just read you the first couple lines here. A private lunar lander's maiden moon mission just assumed a new dimension, helping to preserve some of humanity's precious cultural heritage. A lunar library created by the nonprofit Arch Mission Foundation will be among the first payloads towed to the moon by Astrobotics Peregrine lander in 2020. And it just goes on to more details of that. So that's when that happened, regardless. Now,
was it definitely launched?
yes, it was, and it crashed. Again, all I know is that they hope and they believe that the crystal survived. I would have to dig in deeper to tell you where it landed, but I will send this to you for after if you're more interested.
So there's no editing my wiki entries, right?
No, not prior to that launch. But you know what? I wouldn't be surprised if down the future that's another thing they pursue. Now, knowing what you know now, based on some of the other planetary star systems like Alpha Centauri, Zeta Reticuli, if you were able to focus on one and maybe possibly, let's just say hypothetically, that we were able to see much more detailed to those stars, and then as opposed to using a Kepler telescope, let's just assume there was something even more advanced that would actually let us see things that we are able to see on Mars with that good clarification. Where would your first place be in any of these star systems that you would focus your attention on?
Well, I have to say, Zeta Reticuli doesn't attract me terribly much, although I think it did attract Betty and Barney.
Yeah.
But it's actually a very young star system, so it's unlikely to have. I mean, maybe there's a planet there with a bit of microbial life, but I don't think that there'd be much chance for anything very sophisticated because the whole star system is very old. But that aside, I mean, obviously you look at the closest ones, right? Proxima Centauri, which is the closest other star to us, other than the sun, obviously, is 4.2, 4.3 light years away. And there's a planet around it that's in the habitable zone. And there was even a result announced by the Breakthrough Listen program, I guess it was of like 6 months ago, saying that there was a signal coming from that direction when they aimed a radio telescope down in Australia at it. Is it ET on the line? Well, we don't know. It's, in my opinion, unlikely to really have been ET on the line, but we don't know until it's checked out, and that's something they're doing now.
Was that a signal that was discovered after the fact as opposed to when it came in? And if I'm correct in what I've heard about that, was it that it was found a year or two after the actual signal, or am I completely off on that?
I don't think that it took them that long. They may not have found it real time, but because if they find it real time, then they go back and reobserve it right away. But it's very difficult to find these things, even today, to find them real time. The SETI Institute's experiments always run in real time, but that limits the amount of analysis you can do on the signal too, because whatever you do, your computer has to be fast enough to do it real time. And if you say, no, I'm not going to even try that, I'm going to record the data and and analyze it later, then you can do more sophisticated processing. So it's one of those trade-offs where you can't really evaluate what's the right thing to do because you haven't found anything yet.
There are two things written here from Tom Sawyer. The first one,
Huckleberry Finn. Yeah.
I know, right? The first one, hopefully you know what he's talking about. I'll just read it. What about black goo? I'm not sure what that refers to, but maybe you do.
Well, I think I've got it in my car. I mean, I don't know what black goo is. I know what gray goo is. That's the kind of thing you get if you have something like a von Neumann machine. Maybe not everybody knows what a von Neumann machine is, but this was proposed by a Princeton mathematician, von Neumann, actually. And he he said, he was hypothesizing essentially robots that can make copies of themselves, self-replicating machines. Now you could say, well, intelligent machines, by the way, and you might say, well, we've already got them. They're called humans. But he was thinking in terms of, robotics. And so if you have these self-replicating machines, they don't have to stay on a planet. They can get off the planet. They don't care about air, water, all that stuff. They need a power source. That could just be a bunch of solar cells or something else. And, they could just fly around the galaxy making copies of themselves and eating whatever's necessary in terms of raw materials to make more copies of themselves. And so that's one way you could turn the entire cosmos into gray goo. Another way to turn it into gray goo is there's some physicists who think that protons are unstable and they will eventually decay, which could really ruin your whole day. If all the protons in your house decayed tomorrow and, all the atoms turned into mush, you get gray goo that way. But it's only expected to happen in about 10 to the 22 or 10 to the 23 years. So you got a long wait. I would say you got plenty of opportunities to enjoy takeout meals and so forth before that happens.
The other question is more if you know this following person. It reads, Dr. Seth Shostak, do you know Dr. Marian Rudnick from NASA?
I do not.
Neither. That makes two of us. So, Tom, if you have anything more specific that is less of a yes or no answer, I'd be more than happy to ask it. Now, when Oumuamua hit the airwaves and basically all global media a few years ago, the Harvard astronomer, I believe his name is Dr. Avi Loeb, thought that this might be a derelict spacecraft of some sort. Although it looks like a giant weird rock to me, what were some of the reasons that you could explain to lay people of why someone would make such a jump to something so radical?
Well, there were two strong arguments that Avi Loeb was making. He was, at the time, by the way, the chair of the Harvard Astronomy Department. He's a very smart guy. And he was pointing out two things. One, the motion of this rock told you, first off, that it wasn't from our solar system. For the first time, we'd found something big, bigger than an atom, something big that wasn't from our own solar system, sailing through the solar system, right? An interloper. And so, we deduced that from the motion of this thing. It's just orbital dynamics, physics that was worked out by Isaac Newton in the 17th century. So that was the first thing. It was an interloper. Everybody agreed on that. But then there was the question, well, what is it? Is it an asteroid? Is it a comet? Is it, a hollowed out rock with Klingons on the inside? That sort of thing. And most astronomers who study these sorts of things, asteroids, comets, think that it was an asteroid. But Avi Loeb was putting forward the idea that maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was like Arthur C. Clarke's Rendezvous with Rama, and it's just a hollowed out asteroid with aliens on the inside. It's a deliberately powered spacecraft. In fact, a solar sail powered spacecraft. And the argument that I found most intriguing that Avi was making was that, look, this thing was seen as it was leaving our solar system. It was on the way out, but aren't we all? Okay, it was on the way out, and it already swung around the sun and was leaving the solar system at maybe 10 miles a second or something like that. Okay, what are the chances that a rock that wasn't intelligently guided, that didn't have a pilot or some sort of piloting mechanism, would accidentally come so close to the center of our solar system, which from even the nearest star would be so small you couldn't even resolve it with your eyes. You couldn't see it, even if you had a telescope big enough, right? So it would be, put it this way, it would be comparable to the chances that you throw up a tennis ball in the air and you hit a nickel that's 200 feet away. I mean, it could happen, but the chances are that tennis ball is going to come down somewhere where the nickel isn't, right? So that was, to me, the strongest argument that Avi Loeb was making. He was saying, look, either this thing is got some sort of guidance, or there must be a gazillion of these kinds of things flying around all the time, and this just happened to be one we saw. Well, I think that the evidence so far suggests that the answer to this is not that it's an alien craft, but that it's one of many, many such rocks kicked out by solar systems. But we won't know for a couple of years. I think that's safe to say.
I know when a body goes around a planetary body, in essence, and slingshots around, I could see how the propulsion of such said object being slung around would produce the effect of setting it in another direction. But was there some of the debate because this object, rocky object, essentially sped up and slowed down on its own when it should have done the opposite?
Well, it did seem to have a bit of acceleration. Obviously, it's going to slow down after it goes around the sun because, the sun's gravity is pulling it back. But it seemed to also deviate from what's called a typical Keplerian orbit, named after Johannes Kepler, of course. But that could also be the case for a comet or maybe even an asteroid, because comets, are big kind of ice balls. And so when they go around the sun, some of that ice melts and, it escapes from the comet as vapor. And it's just like little rockets on the surface of this rock that are accelerating it or not. That has been seen for comets, so maybe that's all it was. The other side will argue, look, we expect it to be a comet or an asteroid, and it has the color of a comet or an asteroid, sort of a reddish color. So there's nothing in the observations that suggests really that it's an interstellar craft.
Now, normally I wouldn't ask this following question because you focus on the science when it comes to SETI of sending signals and being able to replicate the experiments. So when something's captured on camera of anomalous craft, I know that's not your expertise, but I'm just curious how people in the SETI group responded to when Commander David Fravor of the F-18 Hornet from the 2004 USS Nimitz carrier that chased the tictac UFO, which was said to violate our known laws of physics. For instance, speeding past the sound barrier without making a sonic boom. Right angle turns, essentially, that would, if there was any life on there, would, the inertia would kill any of us. And when I spoke to Dr. Michio Kaku last, usually in the past, he never talked about craft like that. And I was surprised because I didn't ask him, but yet he brought up that these are possibly extraterrestrial drones, which to me was a huge leap from prior conversations I had with Dr. Michio Kaku. How did this affect SETI, if it did at all? And what was your personal take, which I know, again, is not normally what I would ask you, but just because it was such a global story that still is being talked about today?
Well, I think that what the Navy said was not that it was a UFO. They said it was just an unidentified aerial phenomenon.
Yes.
Which doesn't mean that it's a craft at all, actually. And that's important to keep in mind. I talked to some military pilots. I think one thing, Dr. J, it's worth keeping in mind is that these videos, nobody is questioning whether the videos were real videos. They were real videos. That's not the question. The question is, what is it that you're seeing there?
Yeah.
Now, when I talked to a military pilot, former military pilot about it, he said, this is just a reflection in the optics of the gun sight cameras on the F-18 Hornets. And it is, I think, worth mentioning that, these aliens, if you think they're aliens, you gotta ask yourself, well, gee, why is it that they only want to tease Navy pilots, right? I mean, they don't challenge Army tanks or anything like that. They just want to tease the Navy pilots that have these fancy cameras. And somebody pointed out that he thought that they were internal reflections in the cameras, that all those tic-tacs and the tic-tac and everything else was in fact an artifact of the cameras, which it could be. I've never taken apart one of the cameras, so I can't say that. But the other thing is, if you're convinced that this is really aliens, you should really ask yourself, well, how convincing is it that they're only seen by a certain kind of camera found only on the F-18 Super Hornets?
That's right, the FLIR, yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. Why is it that I mean there are hundreds of thousands of amateur astronomers around the world. They're looking at the sky as often as they can, and they don't see these things.
This question is from Lasha Senyuk. It's about the tic tac, and it reads: does he think the tic tac object could be a natural object, like a frozen hydrate moving along a magnetic stream? My thoughts, just wondering.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Again, here's something else to think about. We have about 750 satellites orbiting the Earth that are both functional because it's 90% of the stuff up there doesn't work anymore. But 10% of his active satellites, 780 or some number like that, 700, 800 satellites up there have cameras looking down, and some of the very high resolution. We're just talking about, the weather reports. You see all these clouds over the Pacific or the Atlantic or whatever. Those are not high resolution. You have intermediate resolution cameras like the ones that make the imagery for Google Earth, for example. And you can go on Google Earth and you can find the truck tire collection in your backyard. I mean, they're good enough to see that. But of course, there are also cameras that have even higher resolution. Those are used by the military, and they're watching the Earth all the time, all the stuff, and somehow they don't see the aliens either. You can say, "Oh well, the government's keeping it quiet." Well, you can believe that or not, but not all those satellites that belong to the U.S. government, certainly, and not even to governments. Right? There's a lot of private companies that do that stuff.
That's right. Like, for instance, Bigelow Aerospace. I know there are at least there's I can't even tell you how many satellites he has up, and of course the two private living quarters, aka private space stations. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We are inundated with satellites, and it's not something that is seen fairly often. Let me read you. Okay, this is back about the WOW signal. This is Tom again, Tom Sawyer. What about WOW signal from 1977? Supposedly there were more signals?
No, well, we talked about that. That was the WOW signal, 1977. There were other signals in those, in the 70s and the 80s before computers became fast enough that you could deal with the data real time. That if you saw something, there would be follow-ups right away. But in those days, as I mentioned, you recorded the data and looked at it later. And the WOW signal is well known because of the name, but there were at least 100 other signals that were found that had characteristics somewhat comparable to the WOW signal.
I'm going to ask you about the black hole that was photographed, which was really astonishing, the feat that it took. Didn't it take literally all the large telescopes on Earth to be in sync to capture this massive black hole?
Well, what you have to do is combine observations made with telescopes that are very far away from one another because you need a very high level of detail. You need high resolution. And the way you get that in the radio, in fact, also in the optical, but is by having telescopes that are separated by many miles. And the maximum number of miles they can be separated is what, like 16 or 17,000 miles. You have one in this part of the world and another on the antipodes, the exact opposite side of the world. That's as far apart as they can get unless you're going to use space antennas, but those aren't very big. So, but by combining data from a network of antennas around the world, they could synthesize that image. And part of the trick here is that you have to be able to make the observations over a period of time. So you let the Earth rotate and that moves the antennas around for you, that kind of thing. But it's all okay because the black hole is not going to change over the course of days or weeks or anything like that. So they made this image, and people have seen it. Everybody has seen it, and it kind of looks like a fuzzy donut. And you can say, "Wow, that was a lot of work to get a picture of a fuzzy donut." But in fact, it does accord with what Einsteinian physics predicts a black hole should look like in the radio. So it's actually a very interesting result.
There's a question and a comment. Let me read you the comment real quick. This is a cool handle. He goes by Bruce Wayne. Hello, Batman. He says, I hope Seth never gives up searching for ET. And please don't, Dr. Shostak. Again, we are all hoping that you finally break the news and make literally the rounds globally when this hopefully happens in your lifetime and in our lifetime. This next question is from Third Phase of the Moon, the world's largest UFO YouTube channel. My friends Blake and Brent Cousins from Hawaii. I'm going to read it word for word for you. It says, "What's Seth's thoughts on the American Airlines sighting? Does Seth think that it was just the pilot's imagination?"
Yeah, I don't know. I did read about that, and there was some confusion of, I think, between whether it was United or American. I think this was over Colorado, right?
I believe so. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they said something cylindrical in shape went over the plane, and they wanted to know what that was. I don't know what it is. I
And,
honestly don't know.
and he did at the very end try to say that it looked like a cruise missile. At least that was the shape of what he mentioned. So some people could say that it possibly was a cruise missile, but that's
Yeah,
going down the rabbit hole. Okay.
yeah. I have no idea.
Another.
It could be that there are other things. It could be. I mean, it isn't a question of challenging the observers here. I mean, they had no reason to make up a story or lie or anything like that. But of course, the fact that you can't explain it doesn't mean that the correct explanation is that the Phrygians are on the attack.
This next one is from Miss Senyak. It says, "Does he have any info about what that black knight object is that is in the sky? Is it space junk or what is it?"
Gosh, black knight object.
Yeah, it's a weird looking. Some people say it's a satellite that was left here by a previous, people that lived here before, or possibly an extraterrestrial satellite that's in orbit around Earth and supposedly 15,000 years old. How they got these answers beats me, but the biggest question is still, what is it?
Well, I haven't heard of it, so I can't really speculate it. If you think it is purpose built, that is to say, it's something artificial, and it's been up in the sky for 15,000 years, I certainly want to hear more about it, because that would be, I mean, the person who wrote you should book their trip to Stockholm, because they're going to get a prize for this. I mean, I don't know what it is, because I'm unfamiliar with this story. There occasionally are things that are seen in the sky that we don't identify right away. They seem to be strange, either, again, asteroids or comets, and sometimes turn out to be, in fact, dead rockets that we ourselves have launched 20 years earlier and, just kept going and then went into orbit around the sun. But I don't know about this one.
What is next for you and SETI?
Well, SETI is always a dynamic enterprise. In other words, things are always changing. And the SETI Institute will be using the Very Large Array, which is down in New Mexico, and has starred in a couple of movies, in particular Contact. Anyhow, it took a lot of makeup. But we're going to be using that in what's called a commensal mode, which means that we sort of piggyback on the operations of that telescope, so that when it's doing, if you will, conventional astronomy, we take some of the data off and analyze that with specialized SETI receivers looking for the kind of signals that we expect ET might make. So, that's something new, because it's a whole new experiment using a whole new telescope. The Chinese certainly make noises to the effect that they're going to be using their gargantuan antenna in China. It's bigger than the one down in Puerto Rico, and so that'll be new. They haven't started actually doing observations for SETI yet, but eventually they will.
There's a couple questions that I see, but I think they're not quite up your alley. But if just for the sake of the people who asked them, I'll go ahead and ask them. And if you don't want to answer them, don't bother.
You may have to cover it up.
Yeah. First one, Cashmore Turbo says, "Are you willing to do a meditation to invite star people or their light ships to your location?"
Well, if my meditation could get them to come to my location, why would we bother with these radio telescopes? I mean, I'd be willing to do a little bit of meditation for the team. I would do that. I don't think it would be very effective, frankly.
I'm with you. If it could work, then I'll move up there and we can end the SETI project and we'll just call them out here to us. Okay. Next one is essentially we talked about the crop circle that you mentioned earlier of where I was wrong about it. And basically this is a more broad question and it reads, what do you know about crop circles in general?
Well, crop circles were a thing for a while. Uh, and, you know, they were appearing to begin with in the counties of Hampshire and Wiltshire in the United Kingdom, southern England, which was sort of interesting. Why is it that the aliens only wanted to get in touch with the British? I mean, maybe they had good reason, but I wasn't sure what it might be. And they were mysterious. Now, a couple of guys, Doug and Dave, were their first names, came out of a pub and said, "Well, we did it. We got to fess up. We did it, and we did it with boards and ropes." And they demonstrated how they could use boards and ropes to make these things. Now, a lot of people were kind of skeptical. They thought they could never make these things; they're too complicated. But they went out and made some and showed that, well, they weren't that complicated. Now, meanwhile, the people who thought, no, these are extraterrestrial messages, they would go into these crop circles and they would look at the way the stalks were built or bent, not built, but bent. They would point out that the making these things would take much too much time, couldn't be a bunch of guys with boards and ropes and this, that, and the other. Now, since then, the whole thing has sort of faded a bit. I think part of it came from the fact that the BBC actually did a story on this a long time ago now, but they put some camera crews with infrared cameras up on hills around fields that are often defaced, if that's the verb you like, by crop circles. And, sure enough, one night something happened. There was a crop circle the next morning. So before they did anything else, the BBC invited the seriologists, these are the serious-minded crop circle inspectors, to come to the crop circle, look it over, and decide, is this for real, or is this some of these artist collectors that are just making art in this poor farmer's wheat? And they looked at it, and they said, well, this one's real. This is alien made. And then the BBC ran their footage, which showed, like a classroom full of people down there the night before stomping on the wheat. So after that, it became more of an art thing than a science thing. But I just suggest to you two things. One, if the aliens want to communicate with us, why would they do it by carving graffiti in the wheat? That's very slow, and it's also you can't get much information there, right? I mean, how do you describe, for example, the government on your planet with a crop circle? I mean, there's no information. And that's the second point. If you look at these crop circle patterns, they're books. They're very attractive, but there's a lot of symmetry in these things. They're like crystals. They have a lot of symmetry. And if you study any information theory, you'll realize that anything that's highly symmetric has very little information. So again, they've come all this way. Who knows? 20 light years, 200 light years, 2,000 light years. Who knows? They've come all this way. They only want to talk to the British. And then they carve a figure in the wheat that doesn't tell you anything. That's a bit of a waste.
There's a couple more questions. Anybody, if you write any questions after this, forgive me, I can't ask them, so save them till next time. So, Dr. Shostak, it's going to go a couple minutes over, and please hang by after we wrap up so I could thank you and ask for one more thing. This next question I really like. Let me read it to you. What's the protocol if you do pick up any alien signal? Would you break the news first to the public right away, or do you have to tell the government first? And that comes from Third Phase of the Moon, the Cousins brothers in Hawaii.
Yeah. No, there's no requirement to tell the government, either our government or, the government of Lower Slobovia. We don't have to tell anybody. I mean, the SETI Institute is a nonprofit private research organization. I'm not even obligated to tell my uncle. But I can tell you what actually happens when you find a signal. There's no policy of secrecy. There's not. People don't believe that, but, that's the fact. And as a result, whenever we pick up a signal that looks interesting, and it occasionally does happen, the media start calling us, right? The newspapers, the radio stations, or the TV shows and so forth. So that's how you will hear about it. It'll be in all the media right away. So yeah, there is a protocol. I was the chair of the committee that actually revamped that protocol, but it's sort of irrelevant because the media get in touch right away.
This other question from Lasha reads, what kind of photographic proof would be enough to be proof? Would he also need physical evidence?
I think that's a good question, but I think you really do need either you need lots of photographs made by lots of people in different locations, right? Or maybe made by objective photographers like, satellites in orbit, or you need physical evidence. Yeah, because if you don't have that, the worst kind of evidence is witness testimony, right? When somebody says, I saw this thing, and it's like what you hear from some of the astronauts, right? That's witness testimony, but that's absolutely the worst because, I mean, if your next door neighbor said, that murder that was committed last night, I did it. Or worse yet, my brother did it, right? And that's witness testimony, but you wouldn't send anybody to the chair for that. You would want better evidence.
Corroboration, that's right. And witnesses are, fallible. It happens a
Oh,
lot.
very fallible. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, last question in the chat that I can take today for this 1 hour show, which is going to go a couple minutes over, but here's the last one. What interesting slash weird slash unexplained things do you see every day or week or month?
I mean, outside of my colleagues?
Yeah, no, within your colleagues, within SETI.
Oh. Well, we don't see weird stuff every day. That's the thing about it. We actually don't, right? We have specialized receivers, big antennas, and, nature produces a lot of radio waves, but we don't even see those because our equipment is built to find the kind of signals that transmitters make, not the kind of signals that a quasar or a pulsar would make. So we're not sensitive to the natural radio emitters in the universe. So if we see something, it's mostly, so far it's exclusively telecommunications equipment, right? A radar set 100 miles away, or, satellites. Satellites produce a lot of interfering signals for us because they're in the sky all the time.
This next part is, well, first of all, I want to thank you, Dr. Shostak. And like I said, please hang by for a quick moment afterwards. I'm going to tie this last part into three. First of all, tell people where they can find you. Second of all, if you have a message for someone who would like to get the proper education to be a part of SETI, what would you say to someone that's considering it? And third, if you have any final statements for anybody out in the world, what would the final thing you say have to be?
Well, I would encourage anybody to get into science, or at least just learn more about science, because science is a great way of understanding the world. And, science is always checking itself. So when science says something is true, what they mean to say is, we think it's true, and we have experiments that show that it's true. So that's a different way of deciding what truth is. I think science is good at that. As far as getting into a field like SETI, it's, the answer is no different than if you'd ask, well, how do I get into organic chemistry? Because I really want to do that when I grow up. And the answer is that is the same. And that is, study some science, read some books. And when you get to college, take science courses. And if you want to actually do research, you got to go to grad school. And of course, then you'll have a major. You'll have a subject that you're already specializing in.
Wow, another incredible conversation with the one and only Dr. Seth Shostak of the SETI Institute, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. I want to thank Pyramid 7 for your super chat, plus everybody else with amazing questions. And anybody whose question I didn't get after I said I couldn't ask anymore, please save them up for the next time, which today was meant to be on video, but there's been some glitches that I've had, which is why it's audio. So I promise that the next hour I book with Dr. Shostak, it will be on video. So with that being said, since I've had some unfortunate missteps being censored for no reason on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, losing all my followers, there are a handful of places where you can find out which guest is upcoming, but the best place is to just hit your notifications and make sure you wait to find out who it'll be that day. I like to surprise you all. With that being said, folks, this is Dr. J along with Dr. Seth Shostak, both of us in California, once in Southern California, the other Northern California, and we are officially signing off. Okay, let's make sure.